"She's the useless one," her in-laws laughed, until the Duke said, "She is the Duchess of my heart." The words would not be spoken until far later in the tale, yet their echoes seemed to tremble already in the bitter air of that winter night, carried on the wind as if fate itself had muttered them first. The snow lay deep upon the Northumberland roads, swallowing the moonlit path in a relentless white silence. It was on such a night that Lady Eleanor Harcourt, chilled to the bone, limping from a twisted ankle, and trembling from humiliation she had not yet confessed, approached the towering doors of Ravenshire Hall. Her carriage lay overturned in the ravine behind her, the horses unharmed but the coachman unable to lift the vehicle alone. She had insisted he remain with the wreck and seek help at dawn. She would not risk his life crossing the icy path with her. Thus she walked alone, leaning on a broken branch used as a makeshift cane, her breath forming fragile clouds in the lantern-lit dark. Inside the estate, the household had only begun to settle when the heavy knocking broke the quiet. Servants exchanged glances. Guests murmured behind doors. The Duke's extended relatives, gathered for the winter season, whispered of ill omens and intruders. When the great oaken door opened, the flickering torchlight revealed her, a young woman with frost clinging to her lashes, cheeks flushed from cold and shame, and a gown torn at the hem from her desperate trek uphill. Her identity shocked the steward into silence. She was a Harcourt, a daughter of the very family whose political rivalry with Ravenshire spanned decades. The name alone gathered tension like a tightened bowstring. Word traveled quickly across the grand entrance hall, rising up staircase banisters and curling into drawing rooms where Henry's in-laws, those who clung to rank as though it were breath, found immediate fuel for their disdain. A Harcourt? At Ravenshire? Alone? One whispered with pointed delight. Another added, "If she is here unescorted, she must be seeking something." "They always are." Their voices dripped with the sort of judgment reserved for those considered beneath usefulness. They had little patience for those who arrived without pedigree of charm or wealth. When Duke Henry of Ravenshire stepped into the hall, silence washed over the gathered faces. At 32, he held an air of solemn authority sharpened by recent widowhood and years spent maintaining fragile peace among fractious noble houses. Lanternlight gilded his dark hair and the immaculate lines of his evening coat. Though he had been preparing for rest, he did not hesitate. He strode toward her with the firm decisiveness of a man who had long been taught that nobility was measured not by pride but by duty to those who sought refuge. "My lady," he said, bowing slightly as Eleanor tried to steady herself, "come inside at once. No guest, invited or not, will be left in the cold under my roof." His tone silenced every whisper. Eleanor tried to curtsy but could not hide the pain shooting up her leg. She apologized in a soft, breathless voice, explaining the accident, the treacherous ice, and her fear of spending the night on the road. She attempted to justify her presence, though she owed none of them explanation. Henry extended his hand with calm assurance. "You owe us no apology," he said. "Your safety is reason enough to open our doors." He instructed the footmen to bring warm blankets, have her ankle tended, and light all corridor lanterns so she would not walk the hall in shadow. The gesture, simple though it appeared, set tongues ablaze. Lanterns were lit for honored guests, not political adversaries. His in-laws gathered near the staircase, their expressions sharpened with contempt. They whispered that she had come seeking favor, perhaps shelter she did not deserve. Eleanor felt their stares like cold needles pressing into her skin. She lowered her gaze, gripping her torn cloak. Shame spread through her chest like a bruise swelling beneath delicate ribs. She had known the world would judge her for stepping foot into Ravenshire, yet she had believed survival outweighed scandal. Now she wondered if she had miscalculated. She was a Harcourt, yes, but she was also a woman alone, and society never forgave vulnerability. Henry guided her toward the nearest settee. The fire crackled brightly, but warmth did little to soften the stiffness in her posture. She thanked him again, voice wavering as though each word required courage to speak. He noticed her trembling and said gently, "You must rest. We will discuss the matter once your strength returns." She nodded but kept her hands folded tightly to stop them from shaking. His presence steadied her breath, yet fear still curled behind her ribs. She had crossed into the territory of a house long taught to distrust her bloodline. Even the servants seemed unsure how to regard her. Upstairs, behind half-open doors, relatives continued their murmuring, as though scandal were a tonic they craved. "She is useless," one sneered. "Even her own family will not claim her tonight." Another added with a scoff, "What does she bring? No dowry, no charm, nothing of merit." Eleanor pretended she could not hear them, but their words seeped beneath her skin, lodging themselves in old wounds formed long before this night. She had grown accustomed to being overlooked in favor of more dazzling sisters, more socially brilliant cousins. She had learned silence as both shield and burden. But tonight their cruelty felt heavier, for she had no ally save the Duke himself. Henry dismissed the in-laws' commentary with a narrow glance that conveyed volumes. His face revealed irritation, though he remained composed. He ordered hot broth and a physician, ensuring Eleanor's comfort without breach of propriety. Yet the room still held the weight of unspoken conflict, for her presence challenged long-standing animosities between Ravenshire and Westmere. Eleanor sensed she had become a battleground simply by surviving the night. When the physician arrived to bind her ankle, Henry stepped aside but remained within view, offering subtle reassurance. She found herself glancing toward him more than she intended. His expression was unreadable, yet something in his eyes held a gentleness she had not expected from a man known for restraint. In that fleeting moment she wondered why such a man commanded both respect and fear in equal measure. But peace did not last. A footman entered with urgent news. A message from her father, the Earl of Westmere, had already reached the neighboring village and would spread by morning. The Earl publicly disapproved of her seeking shelter at Ravenshire Hall. Eleanor closed her eyes. Her father's disdain had followed her even here, turning necessity into disgrace. Henry's jaw tightened. He dismissed the footman and approached her with quiet determination. "Whatever storms he stirs," he said, "you shall not face them alone while under my roof." The word startled her, for no one had ever offered protection without condition. She felt a tear slip down her cheek before she could stop it. Henry noticed but pretended not to. "Rest, Lady Eleanor. Tomorrow will bring clarity." Yet she sensed that clarity would not be gentle. Tonight's refuge had awakened a conflict far larger than an overturned carriage. And thus the night closed upon Ravenshire Hall with lanterns glowing, scandal brewing, and the first fragile thread of connection forming between two souls raised to oppose one another. The storm had eased by morning, yet the air inside Ravenshire Hall remained heavy with judgment, like a veil that refused to lift. Lady Eleanor Harcourt awoke in a guest chamber she had never imagined occupying, its tall mullioned windows frosted at the edges, its hearth glowing with a careful fire the servants had tended through the night. Despite the warmth, she felt the faint tremor of dread in her fingertips. She knew too well that noble houses did not offer shelter without cost, especially when the guest belonged to a rival lineage. As she sat up slowly, adjusting the borrowed nightgown and the woolen blanket draped over her, she heard low footsteps in the corridor, measured, hesitant, searching. For a moment she feared the worst, that Henry's family had come to demand her departure at once. But when the door opened slightly, it was the Duke himself who stood on the threshold, composed yet marked by an expression she could not decipher. "I trust you rested as well as circumstances allowed," Henry said, his tone unusually gentle for a man reputed to speak with austere brevity. She tried to rise in greeting, but the pain in her ankle forced her back against the pillows. Henry stepped forward sharply, as if ready to catch her. "Do not strain yourself," he said. "The physician insists you avoid walking for at least 2 days." Eleanor looked away, heat rising in her cheeks. "I cannot impose so long upon your household," she whispered. "I have already disrupted your peace and brought scandal to your door." Henry's gaze softened at her words. "Peace is far less fragile than you fear," he replied. "And scandal, well, that is a guest we are all accustomed to hosting." She almost smiled but dared not. He gestured to a small tray brought in by a maid, laden with broth, bread, and tea. "You must keep your strength," he said. "Once the road's clear, we shall determine how best to return you home." Eleanor flinched at the word home, for it belonged to a father who had already disowned her in the dark of night. Henry noticed the subtle shift in her expression but chose not to press. With a polite bow he withdrew, leaving her with her thoughts and a hollow ache she had carried for years. By midday, the household had fully awakened, and with it, the whispering resumed. Henry's in-laws gathered in the long gallery overlooking the winter gardens, exchanging thinly veiled commentary about the guest who occupied the east wing. "She hardly speaks," muttered Lady Fairfax, "a woman who valued volume over virtue." "A meek spirit is admirable in Scripture," replied Sir Reginald, "but quite useless in society." Lady Fairfax sniffed. Useless indeed. One might think she arrived hoping to catch the Duke's attention. Yet what has she to offer? Her voice gained a sharp triumph, as though she had discovered a flaw in the marble statue of Ravenshire's dignity. It was precisely at this moment that Henry entered the gallery. His footfalls were calm, but his eyes revealed a storm. "I trust," he said with a polite bow, "that your morning is pleasant." The group fell silent. Henry approached the window, his gaze slipping past the frost to the gardens below where Eleanor, supported by a maid and wearing a thick cloak, attempted a slow walk for fresh air as prescribed by the physician. The sight of her, quiet, resolute, unadorned, seemed to unsettle his in-laws, who depended upon grandeur to feel superior. "She should not be out there," Lady Fairfax muttered. "The cold will worsen her injury." Henry replied without turning, "It is her spirit that requires strengthening now, not merely her ankle." Then with a final glance at the group, he added, "And you would do well not to speak of her as though she cannot hear you through walls." Down in the garden, Eleanor breathed in the sharp winter air, grateful for the crisp silence that sheltered her from humiliation. The snow-laden hedges glistened under a pale sun, casting long shadows that softened the world around her. She felt insignificant yet strangely at peace. The maid assisting her, a young woman named Clara, spoke kindly as she offered an arm. "His Grace ordered the pathways cleared just for your walk," Clara said with a shy smile. Eleanor blinked. "For me?" Clara nodded. "He said you needed the air, and the house needed reminding that kindness is a duty, not an inconvenience." The words warmed Eleanor more than the winter coat ever could. Later, as she rested on a stone bench dusted with snow, Henry approached with deliberate quiet, as though not wishing to interrupt her reverie. "I trust the garden agrees with you," he said. Eleanor rose slightly, wincing. "Very much, Your Grace. The air is clearer here than in the corridors." He understood the implication and offered his arm for support. She hesitated only a moment before accepting. As they walked slowly together, Henry studied her out of the corner of his eye, her lowered lashes, the softness of her voice, the strength beneath her gentleness. He found himself admiring qualities his world undervalued yet desperately needed. "You need not fear their judgment," he said. "My relatives speak often, but seldom with accuracy." Eleanor gave a faint laugh that seemed to surprise even herself. "I have heard such judgment all my life," she said. "Their words sting, but they do not alter who I am." Henry paused. "And who is that?" She looked toward the white horizon. "Someone trying very hard not to be a burden." His expression tightened. "You are not a burden. You are a guest deserving dignity." Before she could reply, a footman rushed toward them with a sealed letter bearing the Harcourt crest. Eleanor's breath caught. She broke the seal with trembling fingers. The letter contained only a single cold sentence from her father. "Your presence at Ravenshire is an embarrassment. Do not return until summoned." Her vision blurred. Henry took the letter gently from her hands, reading the line with a quiet fury that radiated through his stillness. Eleanor turned away, her shoulders trembling. "I thought perhaps he might worry," she whispered. "But he has cast me aside without hesitation." Henry stepped closer, his voice low. "Then know this, a family that rejects you for seeking safety is unworthy of your loyalty." She shook her head. "He is still my father," Henry replied, "and yet he has failed you in the most essential duty, compassion." His words, firm yet tender, pierced through the veil of her sorrow. They returned inside moments before the sky darkened with a sudden flurry of snow. In the entrance hall, Lady Fairfax intercepted them with feigned concern. "My dear Lady Eleanor," she said, "the household has been quite troubled. There is talk in the village already. One must be cautious not to appear dependent on the Duke's charity." Henry's eyes hardened. "She requires no caution," he said. "She is under my protection." The declaration silenced the hall. That evening, Eleanor was invited, reluctantly, by Henry's relatives to join supper. She entered the dining room wearing a simple borrowed gown, its fabric plain beside the jewel-toned silks of the others. The room quieted as she took her seat. Moments later, a draught swept through, causing a candle to flicker near her. Without ceremony, Henry rose, unclasped the embroidered shawl from his shoulders, and placed it gently around her. The gesture was intimate, protective, unmistakable. Gasps rippled across the table. Eleanor felt heat blossom in her cheeks, but Henry offered only a subtle nod, as though ensuring her comfort were the most natural duty in the world. The supper continued, yet the scandal had already taken root. His in-laws exchanged sharp glances, some filled with envy, others with alarm. Eleanor, however, found a strange peace settling within her. For the first time in memory, someone had defended her without obligation, without hesitation. Henry's small kindnesses felt larger than any grand declaration could. Later, as the guests retired, Eleanor paused in the dim corridor, her heart unsteady. She heard Lady Fairfax hiss to her husband, "If the Duke continues down this path, he will tie himself to a woman of no usefulness. Mark my words, it will ruin him." Yet before indignation could wound her deeply, she heard Henry's voice behind her, calm and resonant. "It is not usefulness that defines worth," he said. "And anyone who believes otherwise knows little of true nobility." Eleanor turned, startled to find him standing there. The hall's lantern light softened his stern features. He offered a slight bow. "Rest well, Lady Eleanor. Tomorrow promises clarity." She nodded, feeling for the first time that clarity might indeed come, not as judgment, but as possibility. And so the night settled again upon Ravenshire Hall, carrying with it the first undeniable shift in Henry's heart, and the quiet awakening of a world Eleanor had never dreamed she might belong to. The next morning dawned with a pale, fragile light that seemed almost reluctant to touch the frost-draped grounds of Ravenshire Hall. Eleanor stood near the window of her chamber, leaning lightly on the sill, watching the delicate patterns of ice forming along the glass. She had slept poorly, troubled by her father's cruel dismissal and the whispering disapproval of Henry's relatives. Yet beneath all that heaviness, something gentler stirred, an unspoken gratitude for the Duke's unwavering kindness. It warmed her more than the fire in her hearth, though she scarcely admitted such a feeling to herself. She feared, above all things, hoping for what she believed she could not possess. Outside her door, footsteps paused, followed by a discreet knock. Eleanor straightened her borrowed gown and called softly for the visitor to enter. Henry appeared, carrying a small wooden box sealed with a thin band of ribbon. There was nothing ornate about it, and yet it held the quiet dignity characteristic of everything he touched. "Good morning, Lady Eleanor," he said, offering a faint smile. "I thought it best to deliver this myself. A token from the physician, salve for your ankle and a bandage suited for your walk today." Eleanor accepted the box with careful hands. "You are too generous, Your Grace," she murmured. Henry shook his head. "Generosity implies excess. This is simply appropriate care." For a moment, neither spoke. The silence was not uncomfortable, only charged with a subtle awareness that unsettled them both. Eleanor, feeling the weight of her father's letter return, finally asked, "Have you received any word from Westmere this morning?" Henry's expression cooled. "None. And I do not expect any soon." She looked down. "His anger will grow. I fear I risk bringing trouble to your household merely by breathing its air." Henry stepped closer, his voice lowering. "You risk nothing. It is not your presence that breeds trouble, but his lack of honor." Eleanor met his gaze, surprised by the firmness of his tone. Her heartbeat quickened, though she could not say whether from embarrassment or something far more dangerous. Before she could gather her thoughts, Henry cleared his throat gently and offered his arm. "If your strength allows, I would accompany you to the winter garden," he said. "The air there proved helpful yesterday, and I find it restorative." The pause before his final words seemed deliberate, though he did not explain why. Eleanor accepted the invitation, and together they descended the staircase in quiet harmony. The garden, blanketed in thin snow, shimmered beneath the morning light. Henry guided her slowly through the pathways, ensuring she avoided the slick patches. Eleanor inhaled deeply. The air felt crisp, almost cleansing. "I do not understand why you extend such kindness," she confessed after a time. "My family has never shown you courtesy, yet you show me nothing but patience." Henry considered her words with a solemn expression. "Courtesy is a matter of upbringing," he said. "Compassion, however, is a matter of character, and yours has shown itself repeatedly, even in adversity." Eleanor lowered her gaze. "You give me too much credit," he replied softly. "I believe I give exactly what is due." Their walk carried them toward the stone fountain at the center of the garden, an elegant structure sculpted in the form of a dove spreading its wings. Though frozen now, the fountain had once been known throughout the county as the heart of Ravenshire's beauty. Eleanor touched the icy stone gently. "It must be magnificent in spring." Henry nodded. "It was her favorite place," he said quietly. Only then did Eleanor realize he spoke of his late wife. She withdrew her hand, suddenly unsure whether she had trespassed upon sacred memory. "Forgive me," she whispered. "I did not wish to." "There is nothing to forgive," Henry interrupted, his voice calm but tinged with something unspoken. "Grief softens with time, but remembrance remains. I feared that this garden would forever feel empty." He paused, then added in a voice barely above a breath, "Until you stepped into it." Eleanor's breath caught, though she could not discern the meaning behind his words. Was it gratitude? Affection? Something deeper still? She dared not presume. She turned away, steadied herself, and tried to redirect the conversation. "Your in-laws will not approve of my presence," she said. "They have made it clear that I am unwelcome." Henry's jaw tightened. "Their approval is not required for what I deem correct." "Yet you risk your reputation," she argued gently. "And theirs." Henry took a slow breath. "A reputation built upon the opinions of those who lack compassion is unworthy of preservation." Before Eleanor could respond, Lady Fairfax's sharp voice pierced the air from the garden gate. "Your Grace," she called, her tone honeyed with false concern, "we feared you might be out in this dreadful cold with your guest." Henry did not release Eleanor's arm. "Lady Fairfax," he replied evenly, "the cold is of far less concern than discourtesy." Lady Fairfax's eyes narrowed. "We have received inquiries from the village regarding Lady Eleanor's prolonged stay. Whispers are beginning." Henry stepped forward, placing himself subtly between Eleanor and the older woman. "Let them whisper," he said, voice steel beneath velvet. "Their chatter cannot alter truth." Lady Fairfax's gaze slid to Eleanor, lingering with pointed dissatisfaction. "Some women," she said, "have a way of attracting trouble merely by existing." Eleanor stiffened, but Henry responded before her confidence could fracture. "And some," he said coolly, "have a way of causing trouble out of habit." Lady Fairfax's lips pressed tightly. She bowed stiffly and retreated. When she was gone, Eleanor exhaled shakily. "You defend me more fiercely than anyone ever has," she said. "Why?" Henry's expression tempered, and for a moment he seemed on the verge of revealing something he had long concealed. "Because," he said slowly, "I see clearly what others refuse to see, and I would not have you wounded by their blindness." They began the walk back toward the hall. With each step, Eleanor felt the divide between propriety and longing narrow precariously. Several times she tried to speak but found herself unable. Henry seemed equally guarded, as though wrestling with thoughts he dared not voice. At the entrance, he helped her ascend the final step. Their hands lingered longer than propriety allowed. Eleanor felt a tremor pass through her fingers. Henry's eyes darkened with something like recognition, as though he too felt the impossible stirring between them. She withdrew her hand abruptly. "I should rest," she whispered. The physician insisted. Henry inclined his head, though the stiffness in his movement betrayed disappointment. "Of course. I shall see that supper is brought to your room. Should you require anything, send word." He turned to leave, but Eleanor summoned the courage that had eluded her moments before. "Your Grace," she called softly. He paused. "Yes." She clasped her hands together. "Thank you. For everything. For defending me. For not turning me away when the world expected you to." He met her gaze, and in his eyes, she saw warmth too profound to be mistaken. "It is not in my nature to abandon those who seek refuge," he said. "Least of all you." Eleanor felt her heartbeat quicken, propelled by a hope she did not dare name. Yet the moment slipped away as quickly as it had formed, carried off by the chill wind drifting through the open doorway. As Henry departed down the corridor, Eleanor pressed a hand to her chest. She had entered Ravenshire Hall expecting survival, not tenderness, certainly not the fragile beginnings of something far more dangerous. And as the door closed softly, she understood with startling clarity. She was no longer merely a guest. She had become a turning point in a story much larger than her own. Snow fell steadily over Ravenshire Hall that evening, veiling the grounds in a silver hush that seemed to hold its breath, as though awaiting a confession long withheld. Eleanor sat by the muted glow of her chamber's fire, her thoughts tangled like threads in a tapestry left unfinished. She had spent days wrestling with feelings she dared not name, with fears shaped by years of rejection, and with the troubling truth that her heart had begun to tether itself to the Duke who had shown her more respect in a single week than her own family had afforded her in years. Yet affection, she knew, was a dangerous indulgence. Affection could be mistaken, misread, or worse, unwanted. She pressed a trembling hand to her lips, attempting to steady the whirlwind inside her. A knock sounded softly. Before she could respond, the door opened to reveal Clara the maid, breathless from haste. "My lady," she whispered, "there is trouble in the great hall." Eleanor stiffened. "What sort of trouble?" Clara hesitated. "His Grace's relatives. They demand a family council at once. They say you have become an entanglement." Eleanor's blood chilled. "I must not interfere. This is their affair." Clara shook her head urgently. "My lady, they are speaking of dismissing you from the estate by morning, and they claim His Grace is too blinded to see reason." Eleanor rose immediately, wincing as her ankle protested. "Where is he?" "At the hall, facing them alone." Eleanor walked as swiftly as her injury allowed, guided by Clara's anxious steps. Voices rose before they reached the grand staircase, sharp, insistent, heated. As she paused in the shadows, Eleanor recognized the unmistakable cadence of Lady Fairfax. "This cannot continue," the woman declared. "A Harcourt under our roof, provoking gossip, threatening alliances. Henry, you must send her away tonight." Another voice joined, an uncle whose influence Henry had once relied upon. "Your reputation is not endless, my boy. It can be fractured. Association with that girl will bring ruin. She is of no use, no dowry, no alliance worth preserving, no standing that benefits Ravenshire." Eleanor swallowed, the familiar sting of humiliation rising like unwelcome smoke. She turned to retreat, unable to bear being the source of conflict, but the sound of Henry's voice froze her steps. "You speak of her as though she were an object," he said, his tone low yet carrying more force than raised voices ever could. "She is a woman who sought safety. She is a guest in my home, and she is owed respect." Lady Fairfax scoffed. "Respect? Do you intend to marry her next? Shall we host another scandal for the county to devour?" Henry stepped forward, and the room fell still. "If I chose to marry her, that would be my decision alone." Eleanor's breath stopped. She pressed a hand against the wall to keep momentum from abandoning her entirely. The room below burst into chaos, voices overlapping, shock and disapproval crackling like a storm. "Have you lost your senses? Henry, think what you are saying. You cannot elevate a woman so insignificant." The words battered Eleanor's spirit, yet she remained rooted, unable to flee, unable to breathe. Henry raised his hand, silencing them. "You speak of insignificance as though it is measured by wealth or charm. But true worth is measured by character, and hers surpasses anyone in this room." Lady Fairfax stepped forward, trembling with indignation. "Henry, if you do this, if you tie Ravenshire to that girl, you will divide this family forever." Henry's response was quiet yet resolute. "Then let it divide." Gasps followed, but he did not waver. Eleanor could remain hidden no longer. She stepped into the light, startling the assembly into silence. "Your Grace," she whispered, forcing composure into her voice despite the tremor she felt inside, "please do not quarrel on my account. I never meant to cause discord." Henry turned sharply, relief washing over his features at the sight of her, though concern shadowed it as well. "Eleanor, you should be resting." "I cannot rest while you defend me against your own family," she replied softly. "I am grateful beyond words for your kindness, but I cannot allow my presence to harm your standing. I will depart at once." Her declaration struck him like a blow. "No," he said, stepping forward. "You will not walk out into the cold because of their cruelty." "Then I will leave at dawn," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "With or without their approval. I cannot bear to be the wedge that fractures the only home you have left." Henry shook his head. "You misunderstand. You are not a wedge. You are the reason I see clearly for the first time in years." The hall erupted again, but Henry ignored his relatives. He reached for Eleanor, taking her hands in his. "You believe yourself a burden," he said, voice low and trembling with earnestness. "Yet you have brought a gentleness to Ravenshire I thought forever lost. You have shown me the courage of a woman who endures scorn without bitterness, who faces hardship without complaint, who carries kindness as though it were armor." Eleanor's eyes glistened. She felt the room fade until only Henry's voice remained. "Do not leave. Not because I ask it as a duke, but because I ask it as a man who—" He hesitated, the words catching. "Who fears losing you." Eleanor shook her head, tears spilling freely now. "I cannot be the cause of your ruin." Henry released her hands only to kneel before her, shocking everyone present. "You are not my ruin," he said, voice firm. "You are my salvation. Eleanor, be my wife. Not for alliance, not for duty, but because my heart chose you long before I admitted it." A silence fell so deep it seemed the whole estate held its breath. Eleanor stared at him, trembling, overwhelmed by the sincerity radiating from his eyes. Her heart beat painfully against her ribs. "Henry," she whispered, "I am a Harcourt. Your enemies will not accept me." He looked up at her with unwavering devotion. "Then let them be my enemies. I choose you." Her resolve crumbled like thawing frost. With a sob of surrender, she nodded. "Yes," she breathed. "Yes, I will marry you." Relief surged through Henry, bright and unmistakable. He rose and drew her into his arms, though gently, mindful of propriety even in the midst of triumph. Lady Fairfax gasped, but her protest died beneath Henry's decisive voice. "You may call her useless," he said, turning to his stunned relatives, "but I call her the Duchess of my heart." The words echoed across the vaulted hall, silencing every whisper. By morning, arrangements had been made. The chapel lanterns were lit as they had been on the night she'd arrived, casting gold across the snow. Eleanor, no longer ashamed, walked with quiet dignity beside the man who had seen her worth when no one else had. And when the vows were spoken, the warmth in Henry's gaze banished every shadow that had ever haunted her. Ravenshire had found its Duchess. And she, at last, had found her home.